There is a kind of silence that does not belong to peace. It belongs to vastness, to spaces so wide and so indifferent that the human mind, encountering them for the first time, simply goes quiet. Not from serenity, from something older than serenity, from the recognition, somewhere beneath thought, that you are very small, and that the world you are standing in does not know your name. The Ural Mountains in January are like that. They stretch across the center of Russia for nearly 2,500 kilometers, a long, ancient spine of rock and forest and frozen river, dividing Europe from Asia the way a seam divides a coat. In winter, the landscape becomes something difficult to describe to anyone who has not seen it. The trees, great dark columns of spruce and pine, stand half buried in white. The sky presses low and gray for weeks at a time. The wind moves across the open slopes without hesitation, without mercy, a steady and impersonal force that has no interest in anything it passes through. It was January of 1959. Stalin had been dead for 6 years, but the Soviet Union he had built was very much alive, and it had a particular quality to it, a denseness, a weight, that pressed itself into everything, including the way people moved through the world. The Cold War was in full throat. Sputnik had crossed the sky barely 18 months before. The space race was young, and so was something else. A particular Soviet spirit, part ideology and part genuine adventure, that sent young men and women out into the wilderness on skis and on foot, testing themselves against the land, building themselves into the kind of people the new world would need. In the industrial city of Sverdlovsk, known today as Ekaterinburg, a group of 9 young people was preparing for a journey into that wilderness. Most were students or recent graduates of the Ural Polytechnical Institute. They were experienced hikers, cross-country skiers, people who had spent years learning to read the weather, to pack light, to move efficiently through difficult terrain. They were not reckless. They were not inexperienced. They had done this before many times, and they were good at it. They were planning to ski across the northern Urals to a mountain called Otorten, deep in a region so remote that the indigenous Mansi people, who had lived in these mountains for generations, spoke of it with a particular kind of care. The route would take them through some of the harshest terrain in the region. It would take them across open windswept ridgelines where there was no shelter and no warmth. It would take them, in the end, to the slope of another mountain, one the Mansi called by a name that, translated into Russian, means something like Dead Mountain. That mountain is called Kolet Sayakal. The 9 young people never made it to Otorten. In the weeks and months that followed, search parties would find what remained of them, their tent, their belongings, their bodies. And what those searchers found would begin one of the most quietly haunting mysteries of the 20th century. A mystery that would be classified by the Soviet government, sealed from public view for decades, and that would continue, even now, to resist every explanation offered for it. This is not a story of monsters, exactly. It is not a ghost story, though it has the quality of one. It is the story of 9 real people who walked into a mountain winter and did not come back. And of everything. The evidence, the silence, the strange and terrible details that was left behind in their absence. Settle in. The mountains are waiting. To understand what happened on that slope, you have to first understand who these people were. Not as victims. Not as mystery. As people. Igor Alexeyevich Dyatlov was 23 years old, and he was the kind of person that groups form around naturally without anyone quite deciding it. He was studying radio engineering at the Ural Polytechnical Institute, and he had the mind of an engineer, precise, methodical, interested in how things worked. He had designed and built his own stove specifically for expeditions in cold weather, a lightweight metal construction that could heat a tent in the deepest winter. His classmates and friends described him as calm under pressure, as someone who thought before he spoke, and as someone who, when he had decided something, was very difficult to argue with. He was not domineering, not loud. He simply had the quality, rare and valuable in the wilderness, of inspiring confidence. When Igor Dyatlov told you the weather was manageable, you believed him. When he said the route was clear, you checked your equipment and moved forward. The group had formed, in large part, around him, and the expedition bore his name. He was, by any measure, a good leader, perhaps one of the best they had. Zinaida Alexeyevna Kolmogorova was 22, and she brought to every expedition she went on a quality that the others remembered afterward as brightness, not in the naive sense, but in the way that some people simply carry a kind of warmth with them, a readiness to laugh, a genuine interest in the people around them. She was also a student at the Ural Polytechnical Institute, and she was by all accounts an accomplished and experienced hiker in her own right. Those who knew her well noted that she was not afraid of discomfort. She embraced the hardship of the route the way a certain kind of person embraces cold water, not in spite of the shock, but partly because of it. There are photographs of her from earlier expeditions, smiling at the camera in the middle of a snowstorm, and the smile is real. Zinaida had been close to Igor Dyatlov, and some who knew them both believed there was a romantic feeling between them, though whether this was fully articulated or simply felt, no one could say for certain. Rustam Vladimirovich Slobodin was 23, the son of an engineer, studying at the Ural Polytechnical Institute like so many of the others. He played the mandolin. This detail, for some reason, stays with you, the image of a young man with a mandolin somewhere deep in the winter Urals. He was athletic and physically strong, the kind of person who moved easily through difficult terrain. He was also quietly thoughtful, remembered by friends as someone who listened more than he spoke. He and Dyatlov were close friends and had hiked together on several previous expeditions. Yuri Nikolaevich Doroshenko was 21, the youngest of the main group along with Krivonischenko, and he was large and cheerful and not particularly complicated in the way some of the others were. He was studying radio engineering. He and Krivonischenko were close friends, and on this trip they brought a camera and a mandolin between them and seemed, in the early days at least, to be having the time of their lives. Yuri Alexeyevich Krivonischenko was also 23, and he was perhaps the most boisterous of the group in the early diary entries. Someone who made jokes at camp, who played the mandolin in the evenings when they stopped, who could be heard laughing when others were simply tired. He worked as an engineer and had been involved in work at the Mayak nuclear facility, a detail that would later become significant. Nikolai Vladimirovich the Beaubrignoles was 24, and his name, a French name, passed down through generations from a French ancestor, stood out against the Russian names of the others. He had graduated from the Ural Polytechnical Institute already and was working as an engineer. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him, deeply principled and also deeply ambitious, the kind of person who set standards for himself and met them, and who was slightly impatient with those who did not. He had done this kind of expedition many times. He knew what cold was. He knew what the mountains asked of you. He went willingly. Ludmila Alexandrovna Dubinina was 20 years old, the youngest woman in the group, and she was, by multiple accounts, intensely alive in the way that certain people are, filling any room she was in with a kind of insistent presence. She was passionate, sometimes argumentative, deeply loyal to the people she cared about. She was studying economics. She was the kind of person who kept a diary not because she was required to, but because she needed somewhere to put everything she was feeling. She had hiked extensively and was considered as experienced and capable as anyone in the group. Alexander Sergeyevich Solotarev was 37 years old, significantly older than the rest, and something of an enigma even to those on the expedition with him. He had only recently joined the hiking club at the Ural Polytechnical Institute. He was not a student. He was an instructor in a tourist club in Lermontov, far to the south, and he had come specifically to join this expedition. Why a 37-year-old instructor from a distant city would travel to join this particular group of students in this particular winter is a question that has never been fully answered. His military background was more extensive than most of the others. He was quiet, watchful, friendly enough without being fully known. Some who knew him described him as someone who seemed always slightly apart from the group, present but observing. He was also the only one who went by a nickname, Sasha. Alexander Konstantinovich Kolevatov was 25, and he had a curious history. He had previously worked in Moscow at a classified nuclear research institute before transferring to the Ural Polytechnical Institute to continue his studies. He was reserved, careful with his words, precise in the way that people who work in technical disciplines sometimes become. He and Zolotarev were the two members of the group that the others knew least well, and yet the diaries from the early days of the expedition suggest that the group had come together well, that the shared cold and effort of the early legs had done what shared cold and effort always does, created a quick, wordless intimacy between people who faced the same discomfort at the same time. 9 people. All of them experienced. All of them chosen or choosing. All of them walking willingly into the winter with their skis and their packs and their notebooks and their cameras, full of the particular kind of hope that belongs to people who are young and capable and not yet afraid of anything the world has shown them. They left Sverdlovsk by train on the 25th of January, 1959. The train journey north took most of a day, and the diary entries from this period have a quality of high spirits, jokes recorded, songs mentioned, the kind of restless, eager energy of a group still at the beginning of something. They arrived in the town of Ivdel, far north in the Sverdlovsk Oblast, and then traveled further still by truck and on foot to a small settlement called Vizhay, which would be the last place of any real habitation before the wilderness opened up completely around them. At Vizhay they stayed the night, made their final preparations, spoke to locals about the route ahead. On the 27th of January they began skiing northward into the forest. The early days of the expedition were cold but manageable. The temperatures dropped well below freezing. In the northern Urals in late January, temperatures of -20, -25 Celsius are entirely ordinary, but the group was well equipped and well practiced. They had heavy wool clothing, proper sleeping bags, their tent, which was large and communal and required several people to carry. They had enough food for the full expedition, carefully rationed and distributed among their packs. They had Igor's stove. The forest in those first days was, by the diary accounts, beautiful. They moved through tall spruce trees, through stands of birch still bare and white in the winter cold, their skis making soft sounds in the powder. When the light was good, the low, blue-tinged light of a northern January afternoon, the shadows of the trees stretched long across the snow, and the whole forest had a quality of stillness that was not quite silence, because the trees themselves moved in the breeze, and the snow fell in small dry sprays from the branches when the wind passed through. Zina Ida wrote in her diary about her hands, about how cold they got when she stopped moving, how important it was to keep the pace up. Krivoniskenko played the mandolin in the evenings. There are photographs from these early days that survive, grainy, black and white, the grain of the film giving everything a soft, slightly dreamlike quality. In one photograph, several of the group are smiling broadly at the camera. In another, someone is pulling a heavy pack onto their shoulders, their face turned away. In another, the trees are very dark, and the snow between them is very white, and there is nothing else in the frame. On the 28th of January, one member of the group, Yuri Yudin, turned back. Yudin had been suffering with what may have been sciatica or a joint problem, and the pain had become severe enough that he could not continue. It was, by all accounts, a deeply disappointing decision for him. He had been part of the planning from the beginning, he had wanted to make this journey, but there was no choice. He said his goodbyes to the group, distributed some of his supplies among the others to lighten his pack for the return, and turned south. He was the last person to see them alive. He lived until 2013. For the rest of his life, he carried the weight of that turnaround. He carried their faces. The group continued north without him, 8 and then 9 as the original plan accounted for, moving toward the edge of the forest and the open mountain terrain that lay beyond. The landscape began to change as they climbed, the trees thinning, the wind strengthening, the snow becoming drier and harder and less forgiving underfoot. The trail they were following, such as it was, required periodic navigation decisions, and the diary entries from these later days showed Dyatlov thinking carefully about pace and route, making small adjustments to their plan based on the conditions. On the 30th of January they reached the valley of the Ospia River, and camped there in the forest, in the shelter of the trees. From there, the open slope of Kholat Syakhl was visible, or would have been, on a clear day. On the days they were there, the weather closed in somewhat, and visibility became limited. The cold deepened. That evening, in the forest camp by the Ospia, they ate together and slept. Tomorrow they would leave the shelter of the trees and climb onto the open mountain. It was the last good shelter they would have. The 31st of January, 1959. They broke camp in the morning and began the climb. This is the last day for which there is relatively continuous documentation, a combination of diary entries, photographs taken with the cameras they carried, and the physical evidence found later in the tent. What these sources tell us, assembled carefully against what the investigators later found, gives a picture, incomplete but real, of the final hours before everything changed. The climb onto the open slope was hard going. The forest had provided windbreak and a certain kind of warmth, not actual warmth, because the temperatures were still deeply negative, but the psychological warmth of being enclosed, of having something solid on all sides. When you climb out of a forest and onto an open mountain slope, that quality disappears immediately. The wind arrives. It arrives all at once. It fills everything. It presses against your face and your clothing with a steady, impersonal insistence. There is nowhere to hide from it. The Ural Mountains in this region are not dramatic peaks in the way that the Alps or the Caucasus are dramatic. They are older and rounder and lower, worn down by an enormous passage of time. But their latitude makes them serious. The northern Urals sit at approximately 62 degrees north, which is to say, very far north, comparable to central Alaska or the northern coast of Norway. At that latitude in January, the sun rises low and late and sets early, and the light it provides is thin and gray and offers no warmth at all. The cold is functional. It is structural. It is simply a property of the air itself. On the slope of Kholat Syakhl on the 31st of January, the temperature was somewhere between -20 and -30 Celsius, and the wind was steady and strong. Dyatlov's plan had been to cross the summit of the mountain and descend the other side to the forest of the Lazva River Valley, where they would make camp. This was the most efficient route to their goal. But the conditions on the slope deteriorated as the afternoon advanced, the wind strengthening and the visibility dropping, and they did not make the crossing before the light began to fail. At some point in the late afternoon, the exact time is uncertain, they made the decision to stop and camp on the open slope, rather than retreating to the forest below. This decision has been one of the most debated elements of the entire case. From a strict survival standpoint, the choice seems hard to understand. The forest was not far, perhaps 1.5 kilometers downslope, in the valley below. 1.5 kilometers in difficult conditions is not a trivial distance, but it is not an impossible one either. The trees would have provided shelter from the wind. The cold, while still severe, would have been more manageable. Experienced hikers generally prioritize shelter above almost everything else in this kind of terrain. There are several explanations offered for why they chose the slope instead. One is simply practical. Perhaps the snow in the direction they needed to go was poor for digging, and the slope offered a better surface for the tent anchors. Another is that Dyatlov, who was meticulous about documenting the expedition for his hiking club, may have wanted to record an open slope camp as part of the official challenge of the route. Some suggest that they may have misjudged the distance back to the treeline, or that conditions made it seem simpler to stay than to move. None of these explanations is fully satisfying. Each of them is possible. The tent they erected was a large, canvas construction, not a modern dome or freestanding tent, but a long, flat tent that required careful anchoring and internal poles. They cut into the slope slightly to create a more level platform, driving their skis into the snow around the tent as anchors and windbreaks. The photographs taken that evening, and there are photographs recovered later from the cameras in the tent, Show the tent on the open slope in the gathering winter dusk, the mountain rising behind it, the forest far below, and the wind visible in the way the snow surface has been shaped around the camp. The photographs are very quiet. They have the quality of images taken by people who are tired and cold and ready to be inside, even if inside means a canvas tent with a small metal stove in -20 temperatures. Whatever happened that evening, in the hours between when they went to sleep and whatever came after, happened in a camp that was cold and exposed but not, as far as the evidence shows, in obvious distress. There are no diary entries that suggest fear or premonition. The last entry in the group diary is written in a tone that is almost playful. It describes the camp as being in the most suitable place and mentions the wind, and then it is simply over. The pen stops. The page ends. The next thing anyone would know about them would come weeks later, when searchers began to find what the mountain had left. The group had been due to return to Vizhay by the 12th of February. When they did not arrive, there was no immediate alarm. These expeditions ran on rough schedules, and delays happened. Weather, difficult terrain, small injuries that slowed a group down. The people waiting for them at home knew this, and knew the group was experienced, and gave it a few days before the worry became something they could no longer set aside. By the 20th of February, search parties had been organized. They were not professional rescuers, not in the modern sense. They were fellow students and hikers, people who knew the terrain and knew the group, who volunteered their time and took their own equipment and went north to find their friends. Military search groups joined them shortly afterward, and the search expanded in scope and organization over the following days. On the 26th of February, a search party found the tent. What they found changed the nature of everything. The tent was still standing, still anchored to the slope where it had been erected on the evening of January 31st. It was covered in snow, as you would expect after nearly 4 weeks of winter weather, but it was recognizable and intact. All of the group's equipment was inside. Their food, their clothing, their notebooks and cameras, their boots. Everything they would have needed to survive. Everything that, if you were leaving a tent in an orderly manner, you would take with you. They had not taken it. The tent had been cut open from the inside, the canvas slashed in multiple places by what appeared to be a knife, the cuts made from within, the flaps pushed outward. The cuts were not neat. They were urgent. The snow around the tent bore the traces of the group's departure. Footprints, multiple sets, leading away from the tent and down the slope toward the treeline below. What made these footprints significant, what made them, in fact, deeply wrong, was that many of them showed no signs of proper winter footwear. Some were bootless. Some appeared to show only socked feet. 1 or 2 appeared to be bare. In temperatures of -20 to 30 Celsius, on a wind-blasted open slope, 9 people had cut their way out of their tent and walked away from all of their supplies, without stopping to dress, without stopping to gather boots or coats or anything that might keep them alive. The footprints led downhill, toward the forest, toward the cedar tree. The first 2 bodies were found on the edge of the treeline, near a large, spreading cedar tree. These were Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonischenko, the 2 youngest of the main group, the 2 friends who had brought the mandolin, who had been laughing in the early diary entries. They were lying near the tree, near the remains of a small fire. They were wearing almost nothing, grossly underdressed for the conditions. Their hands and feet were damaged by what initially appeared to be burns, or something that had acted like burns. The fire near the cedar was a puzzle. It was small, and the branches broken from the tree were broken from high up, from 10, even 15 feet above the ground, as though whoever built the fire had climbed the tree to retrieve the branches, which is not a normal way to gather firewood when there is fallen wood on the ground. The bark of the tree was marked. The branches at the upper levels had been stripped. Something had driven these 2 young men, barely dressed, half frozen, to climb a tree in the dark in the depths of winter. 3 more bodies were found a short distance up the slope, between the cedar tree and the tent. Igor Dyatlov was found lying on his back in the snow, his face turned up, one hand clutching a birch tree as though he had grabbed it on his way down. His posture suggested he had been moving toward the tent when he stopped. Rustam Slobodin was found further up, on his face in the snow. Zita Kolmogorova was found closest to the tent, also face down, in a position that, to some of the searchers who found her, looked as though she had been crawling back toward the tent, crawling toward the boots and the coats and the stove and everything she needed. She had not made it. Their expressions, described by the searchers who found them, were not expressions of terror. They were, in most cases, simply the expressions of people who had died from cold. Dyatlov's face, in the photographs taken at the scene, is calm. Zenaida's is turned against the snow. They look like people who simply stopped. But there were 4 more to find. And what searchers would discover, months later, in the ravine below the cedar tree, was something that no amount of cold weather, no matter how extreme, could explain. The 5 bodies found in February told one story. The 4 bodies found in May told another. Begin with the 5. Igor Dyatlov, Rustam Slobodin, and Zinaida Kolmogorova were found in that line between the cedar and the tent, spaced out as though they had been descending from the camp and then, one by one, had simply ceased to move forward. The cause of death for all 3 was hypothermia. The cold had taken them, their core temperatures dropping past the point at which the body can maintain itself. This is, medically, a relatively peaceful way to die. There is a stage of hypothermia in which the shivering stops, in which the person feels, paradoxically, warm, a well-documented phenomenon called paradoxical undressing, in which the dying person removes their clothing because they feel heat rather than cold. This may explain, in part, the absence of proper clothing on some of the group, but it explains it only in part. Rustam Slobodin, the mandolin player, the thoughtful one, had a fracture in his skull. The fracture was described as a 5-centimeter crack, not on the surface of the skull but deeper, in the cranial bone. It was significant enough to cause hemorrhaging, and the investigators considered whether it could have been a fatal injury in itself. Their conclusion was that it was not immediately fatal, but that it would have impaired him significantly, would have contributed to the rapidity with which the cold overcame him. How he received this fracture was not determined. He could have fallen. He could have been struck. Doroshenko and Krivonischenko, found near the cedar tree, were in a more disturbing condition. Both were severely underdressed, dressed in a way that was completely inconsistent with the conditions, in a way that made immediate death from cold not just likely but essentially certain within a short time of the tent being left. Yet they had not simply lain down and died. They had built a fire. They had climbed the cedar tree. The stripped branches high above proved this. Their hands and feet had injuries that were described by the medical examiner as similar in nature to burns, though the source of the burning was not identified with certainty. Later analysis would suggest that these could have been frostbite injuries of an unusual severity. But the damage was significant, and it was present on both of them. Doroshenko, according to the official autopsy, had foam at his mouth, a sign sometimes associated with hypothermia, sometimes with pulmonary injury. Krivonischenko had similar signs. Both had pieces of skin bitten from their own lips and hands, consistent with severe exposure. Their bodies bore the marks of a prolonged struggle against the cold, not a passive surrender, but a fight conducted without the tools needed to win it. Then there were the 4 found in May. The snow melted slowly in the northern Urals, and it was not until the 4th of May that searchers, probing the deep snow in the ravine about 75 meters from the cedar tree, found the remaining 4, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignoles, Ludmila Dubinina, and Alexander Zolotarev. They had been lying under more than 4 meters of snow. The clothing situation was immediately strange. Some of them, Dubinina and Zolotarev in particular, were wearing items of clothing that had clearly come from the bodies of those found earlier. Dubinina was found wearing Krivonischenko's cut-off wool trousers. Someone had taken clothing from the bodies near the cedar tree, from people who were already dead, and used it. This suggested sequence. This suggested that these four had survived longer than the others, long enough to return to the bodies of their friends and take their clothing. But what had killed them was not cold. The autopsies of the four found in the ravine produced findings that the medical examiner described, and that subsequent analysts have repeated, with something close to disbelief. Thibaut Brignoles had sustained a massive fracture of the skull, not a surface crack, but a deep, multi-fragment fracture of the temporal bone, the kind of injury consistent with a very powerful blow or compression. It was the kind of injury you might expect to find after a catastrophic fall from significant height, or after being subjected to very powerful physical force. Dubinina and Zolotarev both had multiple fractured ribs. In Dubinina's case, the rib fractures were bilateral, meaning they were present on both sides of her chest, symmetrically. Several ribs were broken in multiple places. The injuries were described by the medical examiner as similar in nature to those seen in victims of high-speed vehicle accidents, or to the injuries caused by blast waves, by explosive overpressure. Yet the bodies had no external wounds consistent with these injuries. No bruising on the surface of the skin. No lacerations. No marks that would suggest they had been struck by anything or had fallen against any hard surface. The damage was entirely internal. Kolevatov had no major fractures, but his body was found in close proximity to the others, in the same ravine, in the same impossible cold. And then there was Ludmila Dubinina's face. Dubinina was missing her tongue. It was not there. Her eyes were gone. The soft tissues of her lips were absent. The official explanation offered was that these were post-mortem animal predation, that the body, lying in snowmelt water for weeks, had been exposed to small animals or water decomposition. This explanation is, to put it carefully, contested. Medical examiners and forensic specialists who have reviewed the case in the decades since have noted that the pattern of tissue loss was atypical for post-mortem predation, that the tongue in particular, being a muscle well protected within the closed mouth, is not the first or even the primary site of animal feeding. The question of what happened to Ludmila Dubinina's tongue has never been answered. 9 people, all experienced, all gone from their tent in the night without their boots, without their coats, into a winter that should have been survivable if only they had stayed. The 5 found quickly had been killed by cold. The 4 found later had been killed by forces that left no external mark and broke bones from the inside. The mountain gave no explanation. The Soviet state opened an official investigation in February 1959, and by May of the same year, once the final 4 bodies had been recovered and examined, it was effectively over. The lead investigator was a man named Lev Ivanov, a senior official with the Sverdlovsk Regional Prosecutor's Office. Ivanov interviewed witnesses, examined the evidence, reviewed the autopsies, and did what investigators do. He tried to build a coherent account of what had happened. He spent months on it. By all accounts available, he approached it seriously. And then, in May 1959, the case was officially closed, and the findings were sealed. The classification lasted for decades. When the files were finally made at least partially available to researchers, first in the late 1980s under Gorbachev's glasnost, and then more fully in the 1990s, they revealed something remarkable. Ivanov's official conclusion was that the group had died as a result of what he termed an unknown compelling force. Not cold, not avalanche, not accident, an unknown compelling force. Ivanov, in interviews given late in his life, he died in 1997, said more. He said that among the evidence he had examined was testimony from multiple witnesses who reported seeing strange, glowing orbs in the sky over the northern Urals in the weeks around the time of the group's disappearance. These were not isolated reports. They came from several different sources, including military personnel stationed in the region, and other hikers and expedition groups who had been in the field at the time. The glowing orbs were orange or orange-red in color, and they moved in ways that witnesses found difficult to explain. Ivanov said that this evidence had been taken seriously enough within the investigation that it had been referred upward, to levels of the Soviet government above his own authority. He also said that this was the point at which he was told, clearly and without room for discussion, to close the case and classify the findings. Whether Ivanov was telling the complete truth in these late-life interviews, whether the pressure he described was as direct as he recalled, or whether memory and age had sharpened the drama, is impossible to know. What is known is that the case was closed. What is known is that it was classified. What is known is that the official cause of death, for 9 people, including those with catastrophic internal injuries that the medical examiner himself could not explain, was given as hypothermia and the effects of an unnamed and unknown force. There was also the matter of the radiation. When the clothing of some of the group members was tested, specifically the clothing of Dubinina, Zolotarev, and Krivonischenko, the results showed elevated levels of radioactive contamination. The contamination was not uniformly distributed across all items. It was concentrated on specific garments in specific areas, suggesting a directional source rather than a general background exposure. The investigative file noted this finding, and then, in the classification of the case, it was set aside. No explanation was offered. No source was identified. Krivonischenko, remember, had worked at the Mayak nuclear facility. This could potentially explain contamination on his clothing as simple occupational exposure, residue from his work, present on the clothing he brought on the expedition. But it does not explain the contamination found on the clothing of others who had no such occupational history. The families of the 9 were told that their children and siblings and friends had died as a result of natural causes, hypothermia, the mountain, the cold. They were given this explanation and expected to accept it, and in the Soviet Union of 1959, acceptance was not so much a choice as a condition of daily life. They buried their dead. They lived with the grief. They lived, also, with the quiet, persistent sense that what they had been told was not the whole truth. Some of them spent the rest of their lives trying to find out what the rest was. In the 60-plus years since the tent was found on that slope, the Dyatlov Pass incident has attracted every kind of explanation.